General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Not many people would be able to mistake the speaker of this line, none other than Ronald Reagan himself. This famous quote is from Reagan's Brandenburg Address, a speech that some scholars even credit with having ended the Cold War. Through my extensive research, I have become extremely familiar with Reagan's type of speaking and the tactics he used. On June 12, 1987, Reagan delivered his Brandenburg Address, which met its rhetorical situation extremely well. In this speech, we will be analyzing his address in terms of its historical context, audience, occasion, speaker credibility, and content. Let us now begin our analysis by looking at the historical context during which this speech was delivered. This speech was delivered during the middle of the discussions going on between General Secretary Gorbachev and Reagan himself regarding a reduction in nuclear arms. And as Ramesh Ratnazar points out in his book, Tear Down This Wall, no major concessions or agreements had been made between the two superpowers at this point. And it wasn't until 1985, when Gorbachev took office, that some progress is actually made towards ending the nuclear arms race. And this is pointed out in James Arnold and Robert Wiener's book, The Cold War, The Essential Reference Guide. And there's a couple reasons for this. The first reason is that in his first term, Reagan was primarily concerned with fixing the major economic issues that the country was facing. And the main reason is because in the span of 2 years, 3 different Soviet leaders had all died. And that made it extremely hard for him to come up with an agreement between his administration and the Soviet administration, because he'd come up with an agreement with one Soviet leader, and then that leader would die, and then the next leader wouldn't even necessarily have the same views or ideas regarding how he wanted to run his country. So then the agreement that he'd made with the previous Soviet leader didn't even hold up with the new one. And as Ramesh Ratnazar points out in his book, Tear Down This Wall, Reagan was even quoted to have said at one point, "How am I expected to make peace with these people if they keep dying on me?" And so now that we have an understanding of the historical context behind the speech, let's take a closer look at the audience. Despite what it would appear upon first glance, the audience of this speech is not just the people in West Berlin. In fact, Ronald Reagan actually points out himself that it is a worldwide audience when he says in the beginning of the speech, "Our gathering here today is being broadcast throughout Western Europe and North America. I understand that it is being seen and heard as well in the East." And while he does acknowledge that his audience truly is worldwide, he does seem to make it clear that he's mostly concerned with talking to the West Berliners. And this is made clear in lines such as, "Standing before the Brandenburg Gate, every man is a German, separated from his fellow men. Every man is a Berliner, forced to look upon a scar." Now that we have a basic understanding of who the audience was, let's take a closer look at the occasion. Reagan was also concerned about the occasion of his speech, and he always took it very seriously when he was constructing his speech. And as Ellen Reed Gold even points out in her journal article, Ronald Reagan and the Oral Tradition, Reagan kept a stack of 4x6-inch cards in his briefcase and constantly copied out onto the cards examples or statistics from contemporary sources. When Reagan delivered a speech, he selected the cards most appropriate for that audience. And this once again implies that the occasion helped define what the speech was going to be about. He didn't simply take one speech and try and generalize it to all the addresses he'd have to make as president and then force it to fit the occasion. He didn't do that. Instead, he wrote a speech for each address that he'd have to make. And this is made clear in the speech when he applauds the West Berliners for their courage and determination in the events after the Second World War, and when he asks for greater personal freedoms and liberties in West Berlin. And this not only makes clear that he's up to date in current events, but it shows that he was aware of the expectations his audience had regarding his address that he was making. And he actually did a very, very convincing and good job of combining two not necessarily overlapping group of expectations. He not only addressed the expectations of a divided city, he also managed to commemorate the 750th anniversary of the city, which is pretty impressive. So now let's take a look at Reagan as a speaker. Was he credible? Was he reliable? Let's find out. So, as it has it, Reagan was actually a very reliable speaker, and it had partly to do with the fact that he never really changed his views all that much. They were pretty consistent. In fact, you'd see, if you looked, in his earliest political speeches and his later presidential ones, he'd have the same facts, same anecdotes, pretty much everything was the same, which just goes to show that he was very solid in his beliefs and he didn't really change them, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable opposition. And as Toby Glenn Bates points out in his book, The Reagan Rhetoric, History and Memories in 1980s America, as a result, such stalwart stances helped millions of Americans to believe him. And this makes sense because we, as people, are more likely to believe the consistent people than people who constantly change their mind on things all the time. But his consistency wasn't the only thing that made him a reliable speaker. He also backed up his arguments with facts and anecdotes, not just opinions. He didn't just go, oh, this is what it is because I say so and I'm the United States president. No. And this is made clear when he's arguing that Berlin acts as a beacon of hope to the rest of the world. Again, he doesn't just say, oh, I'm the US president, what I say goes, and I say Berlin is a beacon of hope. He points out all the struggles that the Berliners faced since the end of the Second World War, and he shows that even though the city had practically been reduced to rubble at the end of the World War, that they managed to build it back up into one of the best industrial cities in all of Western Europe at that point, which is pretty impressive. So it made sense, and he was arguing that it acted as a beacon of hope. And now that we've taken a look at all the aspects not directly relating to the content of the speech, let's actually look at the speech itself and what it says. So, the major thing that this speech is known for is Reagan's direct challenge to Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. And the reason for this is because it is a really powerful message that he's getting across. In fact, the speech is now pretty much known as Reagan's Tear Down This Wall speech. And that's because the Berlin Wall pretty much acted as a symbol for the entire Cold War. And it stood for the suspicions and tensions between the democratic governments in the West and the communist governments in the East. And it all came to a fever pitch in Berlin, which was split into 4 different sectors. And the 3 sectors in the West had democratic governments, and the 1 sector on the East had a communist government. And this whole city was literally split right down the middle by a big gaping wall, which just went to show that the 2 sides did not trust each other and they were highly suspicious of each other. And when Reagan was saying to Gorbachev, hey, tear down this wall, he was really saying, if you tear down this wall, it's going to show that you're also metaphorically tearing down the suspicions and the tensions between our 2 countries. And that is a really powerful message. So it really does make sense that this whole speech would now be known as the Tear Down This Wall speech because that message was so powerful. Before we wrap up our analysis of Reagan's speech, let's review the key points that we learned today. So on June 12, 1987, Reagan delivered his Brandenburg Address, which met its expectations set forth by its rhetorical situation extremely well. And in this speech, we analyzed his address in terms of its historical context, audience, occasion, speaker credibility, and content. Now that we've learned how to analyze a speech, I have a challenge for you. The next time you hear a speech, I challenge you to actually actively listen to it and analyze it for its meaning. Don't just sit there and let the words pass you by. Actually ponder it and try and figure out its real meaning. After all, there is nothing more powerful than the written word and spoken word. words can bring people together, unite entire nations, and end wars, as we just saw in this analysis. So there's clearly nothing more powerful than the written word, and as soon as that is understood, that's when real communication can take place.